Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Somewhere in the quiet of Merton Place, Nelson prepared himself for the call that he knew was coming, the call that would send him back to sea, back to his destiny, and towards his final immortal battle. Nowhere that summer could Nelson escape the feeling that he was in the center of a huge unfolding drama, inexorably gathering pace towards some historic climax. And you can feel that, the air thickening with inevitability. Nelson, the country's champion, arming himself for the decisive contest. It's as though he senses deep in his bones that this is it. This is the end game, the moment he was born for. When it was time to go, Nelson went up alone to the bedroom where little Horatio lay fast asleep. The house was still. The air was heavy with the kind of silence that comes before heartbreak. For a while, he knelt beside her, his head bowed, lips moving silently in prayer. Then, very gently, he kissed her on the forehead, a father's last benediction, and went downstairs. His boxes had already been loaded onto the coach. Emma stood there, trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. She was trying to be brave, but it was hopeless. When she saw him, her resolve broke. Nelson dropped to his knees and prayed, this time for her, for them, for the strange, fragile happiness they'd managed to carve out against the judgment of the world. Then, for the last time, he clasped her tightly to his chest. Brave Emma, he whispered. Heroic Emma. You encouraged me to go forth. If there were more Emmas, there would be more Nelsons. Then, with that strange mixture of theatre and sincerity that was his trademark, he climbed up into the coach, raised his left hand, and was gone. Later that night, he would write in his journal, Friday night at 10:30, drove from dear, dear Merton, where I left all which I hope there is in the world to go and serve my king and country. May the great God whom I adore enable me to fulfill the expectations of my country. And if it is his good pleasure that I should return, my thanks will never cease being offered up to the throne of his mercy. If it is his good providence to cut short my days upon earth, I bow with the greatest submission, relying that he will protect those so dear to me that I leave behind. His will be done. Amen. 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 An unbelievably moving scene. Now, full disclosure, the initial scene that I set to you about Emma and Horatio, I made it up, but it's exactly the sort of thing Nelson would have said. His departures were always these enormous, melodramatic, almost operatic spectacles, rope and gunpowder and drums and tears. But beneath all that swagger, there was something deeply human, loneliness, fear, and devotion. And that's where I want to take you now, to look past the pomp and the legend and to actually see the man himself. So perhaps before we set sail with him again, a little recap. Where we left off last time, it was July 1805. And to quote the great Russell Crowe in Master and Commander, England was under the threat of invasion. Napoleon's armies were massing across the Channel. Nelson had spent the better part of 2 years chasing the combined fleets of France and Spain, Villeneuve and Gravina, across the Atlantic and back again. And it had been a brutal, relentless pursuit. And finally, Villeneuve holed up in the northern Spanish port of Ferrol. The invasion threat had faded. It was now bottled up, but it wasn't gone entirely. And so Nelson, exhausted and half blind, was granted a very brief reprieve, a chance to go home, to see Emma, to see little Horatio. He landed in Portsmouth on Monday, the 19th of August, and as always, the crowds were waiting. People lined the streets cheering. They tried, as they always did, to unhitch the horses from his carriage and pull him themselves, the national hero. But this time he wouldn't allow it. He was desperate to get home. So he drove on, straight to Merton Place. Emma had been waiting for him for 2 long years. She'd been at Southend-on-Sea, a place that I literally left a month ago. Bathing, of all things. Sea bathing had become the great craze in England, and places like Southend and Brighton were full of it. But Emma had been doing it long before it was fashionable. Her husband, Sir William Hamilton, had even bought her a bathing machine from England to Naples years earlier, so she could protect her complexion from the Italian sun. She was, as ever, ahead of her time. And now at last she would see Nelson again. But let me just go back to the bathing machine because this absolutely fascinated me. It's a glorious contraption of Georgian modesty. If you can imagine a wooden hut on wheels, about the size of a garden shed, painted white or sea blue, or sometimes sea blue and white, with a curtained door and little steps inside. And a horse would actually pull it straight into the sea, the wheels kind of creaking and splashing, while the bather, Emma in this case, waited within, safely shielded from prying eyes, and as she would insist, from the cruel English sun. And once the machine was actually far enough out, she'd step down into the water, the waves lapping at her knees, still concealed behind its wooden walls and canvas awnings. And it was kind of a private chapel to cleanliness, I suppose, and discretion in Georgian times. Only Emma, of course, could make it look glamorous. Anyway, I digress. Back to Merton. When Emma heard Nelson was on his way home, she was absolutely beside herself with excitement. Word reached her early, and she rushed home at once, every nerve on fire. And she'd arranged for little Horatio, now 4 years old, to be brought from Mrs. Gibson's care. Mrs. Gibson being the kindly woman who had acted as the girl's guardian in Nelson's absence. And when Nelson finally arrived, dusty from the road, the reunion was pure joy. He was overwhelmed to see Horatio, this bright, laughing child he adored, but he could never publicly acknowledge. To the world, she was his goddaughter. To him, she was his heart. And he immediately began making plans for her education. Sunday school, naturally. Nelson, the son of a Norfolk parson, never ever forgot his roots. There's this unspoken hope, I think, that Horatio might live with them permanently now, that the three of them might somehow be allowed to exist together as a family. And he was thrilled with what Emma had done to Merton Place. He'd heard rumors that she'd been spending, perhaps a little too freely, but when he saw it, all was forgiven. The house was transformed, 2 old properties merged into one. The grounds expanded, the carriageway grand and sweeping. Emma had turned Merton into a kind of shrine to love, to Nelson, and to herself. Every wall was hung with portraits of them both, Nelson in full dress uniform, Emma as a Greek muse, as a goddess, as Britannia herself. There was a new library, a new kitchen, and a garden that she'd designed by herself. She actually fancied herself a bit of a capability brown, and to be fair, she wasn't half bad. Even Nelson, who had spent his life at sea, could see the beauty in it, the curves of the lawn, the flowers criming the trellises. But domestic bliss wasn't something that fate would allow Admiral Nelson for long. The very next day, duty called. He rode into London to meet with the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, and Lord Castlereagh, the new Secretary for War. And he went there nervously, expecting criticism. After all, he hadn't caught Villeneuve. The French and the Spanish fleets still existed, and for a man like Nelson, I can only imagine that that was failure. But to his surprise, London greeted him as a hero. The newspapers hailed him as the man who had saved the Caribbean for Britain, the Sugar Islands, the jewel of the empire's trade. And rightly so. His pursuit had been relentless, his endurance nothing short of superhuman. And when he walked the Strand, people stopped and stared. American tourists later wrote about seeing him there, sunburnt, thin, upright, walking with a sailor's roll, the missing sleeve of his jacket where he'd lost his arm tucked into his coat. There was no mistaking him. He, at this stage, was probably the most famous man in Britain. And yet, behind all the applause and the admiration, he was already thinking of the sea again, of unfinished business, of destiny. It's extremely hard for us to imagine Nelson's popularity because he lived in an age when heroes were incredibly rare and deeply personal to the populace. Britain was fighting for survival against Napoleon, and Nelson's victories at the Nile and at Copenhagen made him the embodiment of courage and sacrifice and national pride. And of course, without national media, his fame spread through newspapers, songs, and keepsakes. His image was absolutely everywhere. So, in an era before cynicism and scandal, people could still believe wholeheartedly in a flawed, passionate hero, and Nelson became a symbol of everything that Britain wanted to be. When Nelson enters a shop, the doors are thronged till he comes out. The air rings with huzzas, and the dark cloud of the populace again moves on and hangs upon his skirts. And I think it was like that everywhere he went. Lord Minto once came across him in Piccadilly, mobbed by a cheering crowd, and he had to push his way through the mass of people just to reach him. And he wrote afterwards, "It was affecting to see the wonder, the admiration, and the love of the whole world that this man demanded. The moment he is seen, it's beyond anything represented in a play or a poem." And I think all that was very true. Nelson had become something more than a man, more than even a hero. He was theatre made into flesh. To the Admiralty, to London, to the nation, he was no longer simply an officer to be placed within a chain of command. His fame, his sheer magnetic presence had outgrown all of that. He had become the very embodiment of Britain's naval spirit, the face of courage, defiance, and of course, glory at sea. And I find all this very interesting because once he had actually been a troublesome asset. He was brilliant, but he was headstrong and impossible to control. And of course, now he was the very soul of the service itself. And the Admiralty knew that when the great moment came, when Britain's fate hung in the balance, there could only be one man to lead it. To understand it, though, you have to see him as part of a larger picture. Two men standing astride Europe like opposing gods. On one side, you had Horatio Nelson, and on the other side, Napoleon Bonaparte. As the crowds in London worshipped one, they loathed the other. Hatred of Napoleon had reached fever pitch in Britain by 1805. The newspapers, which had once grudgingly admired him, now spat venom. He was called the Corsican Dwarf, a plunderer and murderer, a malignant spirit with a black heart, with crimes of the deepest dye. His ambition to dominate Europe, to bring the world to its knees, was painted as satanic. One paper wrote, "Our prosperity and glory have excited that deadly enmity which would drown our island in blood." Napoleon was hands down the bogeyman, the great enemy of civilization. And so, in contrast, Nelson shone all the brighter. He was Britain's answer to tyranny, the man who stood between freedom and the abyss. Even among the intellectuals and the skeptics, the effect was the same. There were those, like Byron later, who admired Napoleon's genius, who saw him as a kind of tragic splendor. But even Byron worshipped Nelson. Even the Whig salons of Holland House, where Fox's supporters gathered to sneer at government propaganda, could not help but bow to Nelson's aura. He transcended politics, class, and ideology. And for the people, the sailors, the merchants, the mothers praying for their sons at sea, he was the embodiment of England. And soon, England would call on him to defend her one last time. London, by this time, was a city trembling beneath the weight of its own imagination. The invasion panic had reached fever pitch. There had been panics before, of course, every few years, actually, since the French Revolution began, where someone somewhere swore that Bonaparte's army was already on the march. But this one, in 1805, was very different. It actually felt very real, and it felt very imminent. The capital was gripped by rumors, by wild stories of French fleets massing across the channel, of secret tunnels, of monstrous paddle boats big enough to carry whole battalions, and even of invasion by air. great balloons drifting across from Calais full of French troops ready to descend upon Kent. Gilray's cartoons plastered the city, showing Napoleon as a snarling little demon astride the Channel, plotting England's ruin. And the newspapers fanned the flames, publishing breathless reports of spies in Dover, of phantom sails glimpsed in the middle of the night. Walk through London then, and you would see it everywhere. The maps, the caricatures, the endless speculation. The fear was alive and in every tavern and drawing room. And the thing is, it wasn't entirely irrational. Because if Napoleon's army did make it across the Channel, Britain would have been relatively defenseless. The army was incredibly small, barely 100,000 men, and spread very thin across the empire. What professional force Britain had once boasted had been shattered in the Caribbean, in the disastrous invasion of Haiti in the 1790s, and if truth be told, it had never really been properly rebuilt. Napoleon's army, by contrast, was the most formidable fighting machine Europe had ever seen. Hardened veterans who had crushed Austria, Prussia, and Italy. They'd left a trail of looted cities and burned villages in their wake. The stories that filtered back to Britain of massacres, of whole towns sacked, were absolutely terrifying. So when Londoners looked across the Channel and imagined that army on English soil, they weren't being hysterical. They were being realistic. All Napoleon needed was control of the Channel for a single day, just long enough to ferry his troops across. And once they were there, it was over. Britain would fall, the Royal Navy would be humiliated, and the government would have fled to either Scotland or Ireland. One of Napoleon's marshals, André Massena, put it coldly. "We never dreamt of conquering Britain," he said. "It was simply a question of ruining it, of leaving it in such a condition that no one would ever have wanted to possess it." He would have destroyed the dockyards in both Portsmouth and Chatham, burning all the ships, completely wrecking the navy, and of course then the destruction of the towns would then follow. We can smile now, knowing that the invasion never came, but in 1805, those fears were utterly justified. The stakes were as high as they could possibly be. And if the Royal Navy lost control of the seas, Britain was finished. Nelson, he knew it. He felt it. Every nerve in his body told him that his destiny and Britain's survival were one and the same. By August of 1805, the panic reached its crescendo. Napoleon had assembled his invasion force, a monstrous army drawn from every corner of his empire. French, Dutch, Bavarian, camped all along the Channel coast in a line stretching from Boulogne eastwards to Antwerp. Imagine it, tens of thousands of tents, the white canvas glowing under the summer sun, drums rolling, bugles sounding, the French cavalry practicing on the sand, the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's chosen men, the finest soldiers in Europe, standing in ranks that seemed to go on forever. And on the 20th of August, just a day after Nelson's return home, Napoleon himself rode out to review them. A formal inspection, banners snapping at the wind, his generals at his side. The plan was complete. The first wave of invasion, 100,000 men in 2,000 ships, would cross the Channel. A second wave of 50,000 would follow in 600 more. Now, of course, we know how it ends. The invasion never comes, and historians today will tell you it was never really practical. The logistics were impossible. The Royal Navy was too strong. But none of that was known in Britain then. So in August 1805, the fear was actually real. It was immediate, and it was everywhere. One newspaper actually screamed, "The movements on the French coast have given rise to the belief that the invasion of England will be attempted immediately." Across the country, Britain braced herself. As all of this is going on, a system of optical telegraphs were hurriedly built. Great signal towers with flagmen stationed on hilltops, relaying messages in code from the Admiralty at Whitehall all the way across the counties to Chatham and Sheerness and Deal. Along the coast, watchmen tended beacon fires ready to light them the moment a sail appeared upon the horizon. Gun batteries were thrown up, and those squat little Martello towers began to rise along the Kent and Sussex shores, though ironically most of them wouldn't be finished until after Trafalgar. Then, of course, there were the Sea Fencibles, Britain's last desperate line of defense. Effectively, old sailors, one-legged veterans, fishermen, publicans, even boys barely old enough to shave. They drilled seriously with muskets and pikes, ready to repel any invader that should land. Across the country, 400,000 volunteers were training in the fields and the village greens. This was the People's Army, patched together by fear, but more by patriotism. Contingency plans were made for the unthinkable: to close the stock exchange, to secure the gold reserves in the Bank of England, even to move the king and the government north to the Midlands if the French landed. And in Downing Street, William Pitt knew the truth of it, all of it. The hopes and the fears, the survival of Britain itself came down to one thing: control of the Channel. Whoever commanded the sea commanded the fate of the nation. So when news arrived that the French admiral Villeneuve had joined forces with the Spanish under Gravina, London went cold with dread. The combined fleet now outnumbered Nelson's own, and when Admiral Robert Calder, sent to intercept Villeneuve, engaged them but failed to destroy them, allowing them to slip into the port of Ferrol, the outrage was instant. The press howled. Calder is useless, they cried. And to be fair, it's very unfair. Calder had actually fought very bravely, but in Britain, the Navy had one sacred rule: you attack. You always attack. And they'd had that rule ever since poor Admiral Byng had been shot on the deck of his own ship to encourage the others. Hesitation had then become a hanging offense. And that really is why Nelson's return caused such delirium. He embodied the very thing that the nation demanded: audacity, courage, and total unflinching resolve. England was poised on the edge of catastrophe. Napoleon's army waited across the water. The skies above the Channel hung thick with storm. And somewhere in the quiet of Merton Place, Nelson prepared himself for the call that he knew was coming, the call that would send him back to sea, back to his destiny, and towards his final immortal battle. John Sugden, in his brilliant biography of Nelson, captures this moment with extraordinary precision. He writes, "Nowhere that summer could Nelson escape the feeling that he was in the center of a huge unfolding drama, inexorably gathering pace towards some historic climax." And you can feel that, can't you? The air thickening with inevitability. Nelson, the country's champion, arming himself for the decisive contest. It's as though he senses, deep in his bones, that this is it. This is the end game, the moment he was born for. And yes, he absolutely believes he's God's chosen instrument in this task. There's something almost apocalyptic about the way he carries himself that summer, as if he sees not merely a battle on the horizon, but a divine reckoning. He knows that if he can destroy the combined fleet, the French and the Spanish together, it's over. The war at sea would be won. Britain would rule the oceans uncontested. Napoleon's power would wither, his ports strangled by blockade, his empire slowly starved. And I think Nelson's vision was actually a complete annihilation. Not containment, not victory by inches, but the complete and utter destruction of the enemy. And this doctrine, the idea that a decisive, overwhelming strike at close quarters would end wars, was already taking root in the Royal Navy. But it was Nelson who actually made it gospel. He didn't invent it, but he embodied it. He transformed it from theory into fire and fury. And during those long August days at Merton, I would think that's what he's thinking about. Not about the domestic comforts. Maybe not even Emma, though he absolutely adores her. He's thinking tactics. He's thinking maneuvers, angles of attack. Every detail of the coming showdown plays out in his mind like a vision. There's a famous story from this time. Captain Richard Keats, one of Nelson's trusted friends, visits him at Merton, and they take a walk together through the gardens, and Nelson suddenly stops and says, "All right, here's what I'll do. When I see the combined fleet, I'll go straight at them. 2 attacking columns driving straight through their line. I'll split them in 2. And then he looks at Keats and asks, "What do you think of that?" Keats, taken aback but grinning, replies, "I think it will surprise and confound the enemy. They won't know what hit them. And it'll bring on a pell-mell battle." Nelson then nodded. That's exactly what he wants. Confusion, chaos, close combat. No stately dance of ships in parallel lines like something out of a Jane Austen ballroom. Adam Nicholson, in his own magnificent book on Trafalgar, calls it the introduction of chaos as a tool of battle. Nelson wants to shatter the old rules, to throw his fleet into the storm, where British training and gunnery will prevail. But of course, the question is, will he get the chance? He waits and he waits, and I can only imagine that the tension must have been unbearable. And then, just before dawn on Monday, the 2nd of September, a coach comes rattling up the drive to Merton Place. The horses are soaked in sweat, the wheels are splattered with mud, and out steps a stocky naval officer, his coat stiff with sea salt. His name is Captain Henry Blackwood of the frigate Euryalus. He's come all the way from Cadiz, riding through the night, and he's carrying news. Nelson greets him at the door, still in his night clothes, eyes wide. "What is it?" "Villeneuve has left Ferrol," says Blackwood. "He sailed 2 weeks ago on the 13th of August. He was heading for France, but he's turned back. The sight of our cruisers frightened him off. He's now taken refuge in Cadiz. He and Gravina have nearly 40 ships, but their morale is low and they're short of food, water, and supplies." In truth, Villeneuve is finished. Not that Nelson knew this, but he's a broken man. He's lost faith in Napoleon's mad plans, and Napoleon, in turn, has lost faith in him. The Emperor's fury burns across Europe, and Villeneuve, feeling its heat, crumbles under the weight of it. But for Nelson, this is it. This is the moment he's been waiting for, the storm he was born to command. Nelson doesn't know yet the full picture. He doesn't know that Villeneuve is a broken man, that the French admiral's spirit has cracked under the weight of his emperor's rage. But he does know one crucial thing. Villeneuve cannot stay in Cadiz forever. The Spanish port is low on food and water. The ships are short of powder and provisions. Sooner or later, he will have to sail. And when he does, Nelson knows that that will be the moment. But look, it's never without risk. If Villeneuve were to slip out and head east into the Mediterranean, the results could have been catastrophic because there's another Spanish fleet lying in Cartagena. And if the two forces were to join, the balance of power at sea could be tilted again. And if Villeneuve made for the Channel instead, the invasion panic would roar back to life. Britain could be staring once more at the threat of French troops landing on its shores. So I'm pretty sure Nelson is turning all of this over in his mind, every possibility, every risk. And then as dawn breaks over London, he decides, this is it. If he can annihilate Villeneuve now, wipe the combined fleet from the seas, the war is effectively won. So within hours, he's on the move. He climbs into his carriage and he races to London, the wheels hammering against the wet, rough roads. He goes first to the Admiralty, then straight to Downing Street. And there, in Pitt's private study, he meets the Prime Minister and Lord Barnham, the First Lord of the Admiralty. And he doesn't waste time. "Give me the chance," he says. "Let me go. Let me strike. I will eliminate the threat of invasion and give us command of the Mediterranean forever." Pitt, ever the statesman, studies him for a long moment, then nods. He knows what Nelson represents, not just a naval officer, but something mythic, Britain's champion. A little later, Nelson writes to his friend, George Rose, who had been one of Pitt's confidants. It is annihilation, he says, that the country wants, not merely a splendid victory. But there's a practical problem. Barnham tells him, "I've only 70 ships of the line fit for service, and they must cover the entire globe." Even so, Barnham backs him. "You shall have what I can spare. Go back to Cadiz, take command of the fleet. You can choose your own officers, and I will send whatever ships I can find. You may get 20, you may get 30. Let's hope that's enough. Then with a final nod, Barnum hands him his written orders. And they're short, almost stark. Protect Britain's trade. Prevent the enemy from gaining the sea. Everything else is left to your discretion. And that order is actually a remarkable thing because the Admiralty, cautious, bureaucratic, conservative, has effectively said, go, Horatio, do as you see fit. They're entrusting the nation's fate to one man. It's faith, yes, but they also know Nelson, and they also know that this is his destiny. So that evening, the skies are open. Rain sweeps across London. It feels, as John Sugden writes, like nature itself has joined the drama. Grey clouds, heavy air, the world holding its breath. At Merton, Emma is inconsolable. The news that Villeneuve has sailed crushes her. She had hoped, foolishly maybe, that Nelson might be home for months, that this time they would have a little peace. And she writes to her friend, Lady Kitty Bolton. It seems as though I have had a fortnight's dream, and I am awoke to all the misery of this cruel separation. But what can I do? His powerful arm is of such consequence to his country. I cannot say more. My heart is broken. Nelson, meanwhile, barely stops to think. He's dashing back and forth across London, checking supply lists, writing orders, arranging men, provisions, gunpowder, uniforms. Every hour counts. And beneath all that restless energy, there's a quiet fatalism. He knows what he's planning. 2 great columns driving straight into the enemy line. An audacious act that tears up every rule of naval warfare. And he knows what that means. He will lead one of those columns himself. Victory, his flagship, will be the spear point. And that means he will be the first into the storm, the first under fire. He cannot ask his men to face that kind of danger and not face it himself. And so, somewhere deep inside, this battle will make him either immortal or it will kill him. And perhaps, he's at peace with that because destiny, after all, rarely leaves any room for doubt. Nelson's last full day on land, Thursday the 12th of September 1805, is a blur of rain and mud and restless movement. London hums with the sound of coaches and gossip, the city itself still half paralyzed by invasion panic. But Nelson's mind is elsewhere. He spends most of the day in meetings, his energy taut as a bowstring. That morning, he goes first to the Colonial Office to see Lord Castlereagh, and then on to Downing Street. And it's there, in an anteroom, that he has one of the most remarkable chance encounters, I think, in British history. Waiting for his appointment with the Prime Minister, Nelson finds himself sharing the room with another man. Short, composed, with a sharp, beak-like nose and an unmistakable air of self-possession. The 2 men exchange polite small talk, but Nelson, distracted and exhausted, is hardly at his best. He talks quickly, nervously, and mostly about himself. The other man listens, faintly bemused, perhaps even a little irritated. He would later recall, he could not know who I was. He entered at once into conversation with me, if I can call it conversation, for it was almost all on his side and all about himself, in a style so vain and so silly as to surprise and almost disgust me. Of course, that man was Major General Sir Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, fresh from his victories in India, already a rising star in the army, and destined for absolute greatness. When Nelson eventually stepped out of the room, he asked the clerk who the stranger was, and when he returned, everything changed. Wellesley later remembered it vividly. When Nelson came back in, he was altogether a different man, both in manner and matter. What I had called his charlatan style had vanished, and he talked about strategy and politics with a good sense and a knowledge that surprised me equally and more agreeably than the first part of our interview had done. He talked like an officer and a statesman. I do not know that I had ever had a better conversation that interested me more. Of course, it's a story that flatters Wellington. It shows him cool, perceptive, and just a little bit superior. But there's truth in it too. Nelson could be vain, even exhausting, but he could also be dazzling. Once he focused, Once he felt truly seen, that mask dropped and the genius emerged. After that meeting, he saw Castlereagh one last time, then made his final visit to number 10 Downing Street. It was his farewell to William Pitt. And we don't know exactly what was said between them, but when the meeting ended, Pitt did something almost unheard of. He walked Nelson downstairs to his carriage himself. The Prime Minister, aloof, austere, a man not given to sentiment, stood on the steps of number 10 and watched as Nelson climbed in. And I think it was one of the rarest gestures of respect. And then on his way out of London, there was one last detail. So very Nelson. He stopped to check that the newest version of the Admiralty signal book had been dispatched to the fleet. Not glamour, not glory, but signals, communication, precision, the small things that turn chaos into victory. Even at the height of destiny, Nelson understood the power of detail. That evening, Nelson returns to Merton in time for dinner. The house would usually have been light and full of laughter, and I can only imagine that night it would have felt very different, weighted, subdued. Lord Minto, who was there for that dinner, later described Emma as unable to eat or drink and near swooning. And he actually said that her display was overwrought, slightly theatrical even. And I can only think that he's actually missing the point entirely. I don't think she was performing. I think she was showing what utter heartbreak would have been like. Emma knows deep down that this might be the last night that she ever spends with Nelson. And she's right. Nelson tries to keep the conversation cheerful, but there's an unspoken tension between them, an awareness of the clock ticking down. The candlelight flickers on his face as he tries to smile, but his eyes kept dropping to the floor. The next day, Friday the 13th of September, is their final day together. The sky is now low and grey. A wind rattles the garden windows. They stay indoors, moving through the house like ghosts, half afraid to speak. And it's on this day that they actually take communion together, just the two of them. And they exchange gold rings in what they call a private sacrament. And for them, it's not a gesture. It's a marriage. An unblessed one, yes, but a marriage of spirit, bound not by law, but by love. Emma later said that Nelson's ring, mounted with a large letter H, was engraved with that day's date, September the 13th, 1805. They knew, both of them, what this meant. If destiny was calling Nelson to sea, it was also calling him away from her. The day itself is quiet, almost ordinary. Nelson pays bills, architect's invoices, prints of himself, orders for wine. The domestic rituals of a man who knows he may never return. Outside, the carriage waits, ordered for 10 o'clock that night. When the hour comes, the scene unfolds with unbearable poignancy. The coach stands ready in the drive. The luggage has been stowed. The lamps throw long shadows across the gravel. Emma can't bring herself to come outside. She's in tears. Nelson steps in and out of the house 4 times, unable to go, each time finding her still weeping. Finally, he kneels as if in prayer and blesses her. "Brave Emma," he whispers, "heroic Emma, you encourage me to go forth. If there were more Emmas, there would be more Nelsons." It's the line that I started this podcast with, and I think it's also a line that's echoed down through the centuries. It's his last declaration, and I think it's as tender as it is tragic. Just before stepping into the coach, he turns to his brother-in-law, George Matcham, husband to his beloved sister, Catherine. Nelson apologizes, saying softly, "I'm sorry I've not done more for our family. I should have made more money. Perhaps this time I'll win some prize money." Matcham shakes his head. "We wait for nothing," he said. "All that matters to us is that you come home safe." Nelson nods, perhaps even smiles, and then climbs into the coach, raises his left hand in farewell, and disappears into the night. At 6 o'clock the next morning, his carriage rolls to a stop outside the George Inn at Portsmouth. The air is cool, the sky pale with dawn. Before he steps out, Nelson takes up his pen and writes a final note to Emma, his final letter from English soil. "Somehow I have arrived here. Victory is at St. Helens. If possible, I shall be at sea this day. God protect you, my dear Emma. Simple words, really, but written with the weight of a man who knows he may never write again. Portsmouth, of course, when he arrives, is in absolute chaos. The great dockyard of Empire is alive with the thunder of preparation. Carts creaking under the load of shot and powder, wagons rumbling through the cobbled streets, sailors shouting, hammers ringing, drums beating, the sound of a nation arming for war. And yet, in the middle of all this, Nelson finds time for something almost absurdly human. He goes to see a new factory that's about to open, the Portsmouth Block Mills. Its vast, echoing hall filled with the smell of oil and sawdust, and it's powdered, astonishingly, by steam. Designed by a French exile, Marc Isambard Brunel, the father, incidentally, of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and it's the most advanced industrial site on the planet. The machines there turn out great wooden pulley blocks that keep a ship like Victory alive, the ropes that raise and lower her sails, the intricate web that makes her a living, breathing thing. And here's the extraordinary thing. Some of those machines, the ones whirring and clattering as Nelson walks past that morning in 1805, would still be in operation when the Falklands Task Force sailed from Portsmouth in 1982, nearly 2 centuries later. The same sound, the same machines, history turning on its own wheel. When that visit is over, Nelson slips quietly back to the George Inn, avoiding the crowds that have begun to gather outside. He takes his breakfast in silence. Then, when the hour comes, he leaves by the back door, crossing the yard that leads down to the water. He's heading for the beach, and by a strange twist of fate, it's the same beach where the bathing machines stand, the sort that Emma had once used at Southend-on-Sea. A touch of poetry or irony, depending on how you see it. He's trying to avoid attention, of course, but it's impossible. Word has spread. Hundreds of people line the way to the shore, and as he passes, they surge forward. Some kneel, some reach out to touch his coat. Some are openly weeping. They cheer, they shout his name, and as he reaches the boat that will take him to victory, the crowd gives 3 thunderous huzzas that echo across the harbor. Nelson turns and raises his hat and smiles. I had their huzzas before, he murmurs softly, almost to himself. I have their hearts now. By 11:30 that morning, he's aboard Victory. The great ship creaks and settles under his feet, her decks gleaming, her men standing to attention. The wind is fresh from the west. The tide is running strong. And as the anchor rises, Nelson's last voyage begins. There would have been the sound of gulls, the splash of oars, the cheers fading behind him. England's greatest son sailing into legend. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altodomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. It's Saturday the 14th of September 1805. Horatio Nelson has rejoined HMS Victory, his beloved flagship, and is preparing to sail south to face the combined might of France and Spain. And sadly, he has exactly 1 month and 1 week left to live. The Victory herself is magnificent. Old, yes, nearly 40 years of service, but still the pride of the fleet. She had been launched back in 1765 and named in honor of British triumphs during the 7 Years' War. She's a veteran of countless battles, a survivor of storms and cannon fire. And of course, while Nelson was ashore, she'd been refitted from stem to stern. Her timbers had been recaulked, her rigging renewed, her decks scrubbed to a golden sheen. Even her guns, all 104 of them, had been dismantled, checked, and reassembled. She was, in every sense, ready for war. The same couldn't quite be said for her crew. They were tired. Many hadn't actually set foot on shore in months. But under Nelson's friend, Captain Thomas Hardy, the famous Kiss Me Hardy, they'd been kept healthy and disciplined. Hardy's sailors were lean, sun-darkened, and strong. They were the best fighting men in the world, and they knew it. And now, with Nelson back on board, their spirits soared. There's a kind of electricity that runs through a ship when a legend like Nelson steps back on deck. Men whispered his name, craning to catch sight of him. Nelson walked the planks with that stooped, awkward gait of his empty sleeve pinned neatly to his chest, his face weathered and deeply lined. But his presence, his very being, seemed to fill the ship. One seaman later said, "When he came aboard, we felt we could take on the world." They weighed anchor and set course for the coast of Spain. Progress was slow. The weather was foul, fog drifting in from the Atlantic, the wind contrary and fitful. The sea itself seemed reluctant to yield its secrets. And yet, even in the midst of this uncertainty, Nelson found time to write. Each night, by the light of a cabin lamp, he took up his pen and he wrote to Emma. His letters from this voyage are full of tenderness. None of the bluster of battle, none of the vanity people accused him of in London. Just love, plain and unguarded. "Cheer up, my dearest," he tells her. "We shall yet have many, many happy years together, surrounded by our children and our children's children." And I think this is a promise that both of them perhaps already knew could never be kept. For nearly 2 weeks, they fought their way south, edging down the coast of Portugal. On the 25th of September, they sighted Lisbon. 3 days later, they reached the fleet off Cadiz. And there waiting for him were his captains. Now, many of these men were strangers to Nelson. They weren't the old band of brothers who'd kind of followed him to glory at the Nile. These were younger officers, some barely tested in battle. Only 5 had ever commanded a ship of the line in action before. Yet among them were names that would echo eventually through naval history. Thomas Hardy, of course, his loyal flag captain. Thomas Fremantle, bold and fearless. Edward Berry, gallant to the point of reckless. And of course, Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, Nelson's oldest friend, his steadfast companion in both war and peace. Collingwood was a contrast to Nelson in every way. A quiet, decent man, gentle in speech, humble in manner. He loved his garden in Northumberland, he loved his books, and he loved his dog, Bounce. No theatrics, no poetry, just calm, steady, and honorable. And yet, though he lacked Nelson's flair, his men absolutely adored him. When Nelson arrived aboard his flagship, the excitement among the captains was electric. They crowded to greet him, their faces bright with anticipation. To them, Nelson wasn't just their commander. He was a living legend, a living embodiment of courage, and his presence meant that the hour of reckoning was close at hand. And from that moment, the fleet began to hum with an energy and a purpose that it never had before. Nelson's arrival had turned waiting into destiny. Immediately, Nelson takes command. He surveys the horizon, the faint outline of the Spanish coast shimmering through the haze. And he makes his decision. We have to pull back. The fleet must not sit too close to Cadiz, because he knows from bitter experience what happens when a blockade is too tight. And it had been his one great frustration at Toulon years before, when the French had slipped out under the cover of fog. Never again. So now he keeps the main fleet just beyond the horizon, invisible but always near, while a screen of frigates stays behind to watch the port. They will signal the moment when Villeneuve moves. Nelson wants the enemy to come out, to take the bait, to believe that they have a chance. Only then can he strike the blow that he's been dreaming of for months, the annihilation of the combined fleet. But for now they wait. The weather is clear, the air is dry and still. No wind, no movement. The French and Spanish ships sit at anchor, their sails furled, their crews restless and hungry. They won't move in such conditions. So the days pass and the sea lies quiet. The next day, Sunday the 29th of September, is Nelson's 47th birthday. He has 22 days to live. That afternoon, he begins the real work, not of maneuvering ships, but of shaping minds. He knows most of his captains are young and untested, not the same hardened band of brothers who fought with him at the Nile. So he sets out to bind them together, to make them believe in him, to believe in each other, and to believe in his plan. One by one, in small groups, he invites them aboard Victory to dine with him in his great cabin, a long, low room that still glows with his presence today. The silver gleams, the candles flicker, the scent of roast meat and brandy hangs in the air. It's convivial, it's easy, almost domestic. Nelson smiles, he laughs, he makes them feel seen. He asks for their thoughts, he listens to their jokes, and of course the tension would have melted away. Captain Thomas Fremantle wrote afterwards, "We dined with Lord Nelson, the juniors and I never passed a pleasanter day. I stayed with him until 8 that night. He would not let me leave him before then." Another captain, George Duff, wrote to his wife, "I dined yesterday with his lordship and had a very merry dinner. He is certainly the pleasantest admiral I have ever served under. So good and pleasant a man that we all wish to do what he likes without any kind of orders." Nelson's genius was never just in strategy. It was in the way he made others want to fight for him. He created not an army of subordinates, but a brotherhood of believers. Over the following days, he explains to them what he calls the Nelson touch. It's simple, daring, and completely revolutionary. No more cautious lines of battle, no stately exchanges of broadsides. He will drive straight at the enemy, full sail, 2 great columns smashing through their lines like spears through glass. Confusion, close combat, chaos. And in that chaos, he tells them, victory. It's the annihilation, he tells them, that the country wants, not merely a splendid victory. And of course, he believes utterly in his men, in their training, in their gunnery. His captains are the best, his sailors the finest in the world. And his plan, the Nelson touch, I think it reflects that confidence back at them. They leave those dinners fired with purpose. He writes to Emma, "When I explained my plan to them, it was like an electric shock. Some shed tears, all approved. It was new, it was singular, it was simple." And of course, he's right. It's more than a tactic, it's a mindset. The Royal Navy has changed. The old measured duels at sea are gone. The new doctrine is audacity. Attack, destroy, decide the war in a single day. As September falls into October, the weighting grows heavier. The fleet now numbers 33 ships of the line, most of them 74s, the workhorses of their age. 4 frigates patrol ahead. Together they carry over 20,000 men, sailors and marines from across the world. The Victory's muster roll alone reads like a map of empire. Englishmen, Scots, Irishmen, 22 Americans, 9 men from the West Indies, Maltese, Russians, and even 3 Frenchmen who've chosen to fight against their own. One African sailor, George Ryan, is later immortalized in the reliefs at the base of Nelson's column. You can still see him there today. It is in every sense a global fleet, and it waits silent and ready for the wind that will carry them towards their fate. For Nelson, keeping his men fit and healthy was everything. He knew that discipline and morale, not just gunpowder, won battles. And so, in those long, still weeks off Cadiz, while the French and Spanish refused to come out, Nelson's war became one of paperwork and patience. Every day, he oversaw the endless grind of logistics. He organized supplies, ordered fresh food and seawater, and he kept the fleet drilling, gunnery, maneuvers, sail handling. He wanted no rust, no hesitation. He sent men ashore in Gibraltar and Tangier to trade for oranges and lemons, anything to ward off scurvy. And famously, he dispatched a young officer by the name of Francis Austin, yes, Jane Austen's brother, to collect citrus from the coast. And of course, poor Austen did his duty so well that he actually missed the great battle entirely. And when Victory finally met her fate off Cape Trafalgar, he was actually on land counting crates of fruit. Nelson, meanwhile, was restless. He spent his evenings pacing the quarterdeck or writing letters to Emma, pouring his heart onto the page, his longing sharpened by the stillness of the sea. And yes, occasionally he turned to poetry. His final love poem reads, "No comments either star shall know, while far from thee, mist lengthening hours of woe, I gaze in sorrow o'er the boundless deep, with eyes which, were they not ashamed, would weep." I love that. It's simple, it's tender, and it's utterly sincere. A man who had faced cannon fire without flinching is undone by distance and, of course, by the woman he loves. And while Nelson writes, his captains are busy doing something symbolic, something that will give their fleet a unity of purpose and pride. They begin to paint their ships in black and yellow, the distinctive color scheme Nelson favored. Some say he ordered it, others say it was spontaneous, kind of born of admiration. Captain George Duff put it beautifully. "We are painting our ships a la Nelson, a swarm of hornets." A swarm of hornets. And I think that's exactly what he wanted them to be: fast, furious, and united. Still, the French and Spanish refused to sail. Days turned to weeks, and on the 2nd of October, Nelson sends a small squadron under Thomas Lewis south to Gibraltar and North Africa for food and water. 6 ships, so his numbers effectively drop from 33 to 27. And of course, now he's outnumbered. On the 4th of October, he writes his final tactical letter to Collingwood. It's part strategy and also part farewell between friends. He writes, "My dear Cole, I send you this so you know exactly what I mean to do and that you may use your own initiative to carry it out according to the general plan. We can, my dear Cole, have no little jealousies. We can only have one great object in view, that of annihilating our enemies and obtaining a glorious peace for our country. No man has more confidence in another than I have in you, and no man will render your service more justice than your very old friend." It's not just a set of instructions, it's a bond of trust. 2 men united by honor, facing the same storm. Nelson's plan remains what it always was. 2 great columns attacking the enemy head on. He will lead the northern column in victory. Collingwood will lead the southern in royal sovereign. It's unprecedented. Admirals traditionally commanded from the center, safe, overseeing the fight. But Nelson refuses that and leads from the front. The tactic, I think, is bold and deadly. As victory drives straight at the enemy line, she'll be raked by broadsides from multiple ships before she can bring her own guns to bear. It's like charging a wall of muskets with an empty pistol, and Nelson knows it. That's why his sense of fatalism feels less like superstition and more like realism. Still, the combined fleet doesn't move. The days drag on. Nelson writes in his journal, he drills his men, he inspects the decks, and of course he watches the horizon. And by the middle of October, even his patience is thinning. Then on Friday the 18th, something shifts. The wind changes. Nelson notes in his journal, "Fine weather, wind easterly. The enemy cannot have finer weather to set sail." Collingwood sends him a message that day. Surely Villeneuve will move now. But the day passes and no sails appear. The next morning, Saturday the 19th of October, Nelson is in his cabin writing a light-hearted note to Collingwood. "Dear Cole, I invite you to dinner with me, and of course you must bring Bounce. What a beautiful day. Will you be tempted out of your ship? If you will hoist the Ascent and Victory's pendant," but he never finishes that letter, because at that very moment, a signal flutters up from the frigates to the east. The lookouts on Victory's quarterdeck cry out. Flags snap in the wind. The French are sailing. 50 miles away in Cadiz, Villeneuve, tormented, humiliated, driven half bad by Napoleon's fury, has finally cracked. His ships, short of food and ravaged by yellow fever, can no longer stay at anchor. Half his men aren't sailors at all. They're actually soldiers, slaves from France's Caribbean colonies, conscripted into service. And they're terrified and they're untrained. The harbor stinks of sickness and despair. And so, On that bright October morning, Villeneuve gives the order to sail, and the combined fleet comes out. And Nelson's fate, long delayed, is finally on its way to meet him. It's Saturday, the 19th of October, 1805. For months he's been holed up there, sulking and tormented, despising his own fleet. He calls them herdsmen and beggars. And in early October, a dispatch arrives from Napoleon himself, an imperial command ordering Villeneuve to break out of Cadiz and head east towards Italy. Bonaparte is already dreaming of another war, this time against Naples. Villeneuve reads the orders and mutters that it's madness. To sail now, with Nelson waiting just beyond the horizon, is suicide. But of course, then everything changes. He hears that Nelson has actually detached 6 ships under Thomas Lewis to collect supplies. And for the first time in months, the French and Spanish fleets outnumber the British. And second, more dangerous news still, he learns that Napoleon is about to sack him. His replacement is already on the way. In Paris, they're calling Villeneuve a coward, the man who ran from Nelson at the Nile, the man who dares not face him again. And you can only imagine Villeneuve's pride can't take it. He tells his officers, "They will see if I know how to fight." And though history often paints him as weak, I think that's rather unfair. There's courage in his decision to sail. There's pride and there's honor, and of course there's desperation. But there's courage too. On the 18th of October, he meets with his Spanish counterpart, Admiral Gravina, a brave and decent man who privately thinks the plan is lunacy. But his orders are clear: obey Villeneuve. And together they attend Mass at the Church of Our Lady of Carmen, the sailors' patron saint. This has to be a good omen. And then as dusk falls, the great harbor of Cadiz grows silent. Crowds line the quays, waiting in somber stillness as the ships begin to move. One by one, the great hulks drifting through the mist, lanterns growing faintly in the dark. And it would have taken all night, but by dawn on the 19th, the combined fleet is at sea. And 50 miles away, aboard Victory, Nelson receives the signal. Dinner with Collingwood, his trusted friend, is forgotten. He snaps into action. He orders a general chase to windward. Within moments, the British fleet is alive with noise and motion. Anchors weighed, sails unfurled, hammocks rolled, bulkheads struck down, furniture stowed, animals slaughtered or thrown overboard. All except one. Bounce. Collingwood's dog is spared. Though, if truth be told, he was actually hiding below decks, trembling at the sound of the noise. On Victory, Nelson's cabin is cleared, his personal effects stored away, his silver plate, his glassware, and the most precious things of all, portraits of Emma and of little Horatio. And even now, amid the thunder of preparations, he finds that quiet moment to write that I talked about in my first episode. My dearest, beloved Emma, the dear friend of my bosom, the signal has been made that the enemy's combined fleets are coming out of port. May the God of battles crown my endeavors with success. At all events, I will take care that my name shall ever be most dear to you and Horatio, both of whom I love as much as my own life. And as my last writing before the battle will be to you, I hope in God that I shall live to finish my letter after the battle. And then he writes to Horatio. My dearest angel, I was made happy by your letter of September the 19th, and I rejoice to hear that you are so very good a girl and love my dear Lady Hamilton, who most dearly loves you. Give her a kiss for me. The combined fleet of the enemy are reported to be coming out of Cadiz, and therefore I answer your letter to mark to you that you are ever upmost in my thoughts. Receive, my dearest Horatio, the affectionate parental blessing of your father. And he actually signs it, your father, something that he had never done before. By Sunday, the 20th of October, rain lashes the decks. The sea is grey and heavy with mist, and there's no sign of the enemy. Nelson even wonders if Villeneuve has actually turned back to port. And then a frigate signal flashes through the haze. The enemy is still at sea and heading east. At 10 that morning, Collingwood rows across with 3 captains for one final conference aboard Victory. When we find them, Collingwood says, we should attack at once. Nelson shakes his head. No, we're too close to Cadiz. They might fight until dark, but then escape. We wait for the open sea, and we strike at dawn. We will only get one chance, and we must not waste it. By the evening, they are 20 miles southwest of Cadiz, still without a signal sighting. But then at 6 o'clock, Henry Blackwood's frigate fires a signal. 30 enemy ships to the northeast. Darkness falls. Nelson paces the deck. It is the last night of his life. He can't sleep. Above him, the blue signal lights of the frigates gleam faintly in the darkness. Every hour, Blackwood fires a gun to reassure him that the enemy is still in sight. Everything Nelson has ever lived for, his king, his country, Emma, Horatio, his honor, now hangs in the balance. And as the hours pass, midnight, 1, 2, 3, 4, he feels it in his bones that the end is near. Then at 5, the rain stops. The wind eases to a calm breeze, and in the east, the faintest light begins to bleed across the sky. And from the masthead comes a cry, a sail on the starboard bow. And there they are, framed against the dawn, a forest of masts rising from the mist, the combined fleet of France and Spain. It's Monday, the 21st of October, 1805, and Nelson's day of destiny has come. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.